Watch this space. Syria blasts misleading OPCW report on alleged Duma attack. The OPCW was revealed to have suppressed findings in its initial report that suggested that the Duma attack never took place. Syria made a statement on 28 January rejecting the report issued a day earlier by the Investigation and Identification Team of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons regarding the alleged use of chlorine by the Damascus government in Duma in 2018. Syria totally rejects the report released by the so-called Investigation and Identification Team of the OPCW, the IIT of the OPCW, about the alleged chemical attack in Duma in April 2018. In addition to its conclusions, the country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates said, "Those who prepared this report insist to ignore all the above information or the objective information which was provided by some countries, parties, experts, academics, documented media reports, and former OPCW inspectors with knowledge and expertise, which confirmed beyond any doubt that the Duma incident was completely fabricated," the ministry statement added. The Syrian statement was a response to the new report released by the OPCW's Investigation and Identification Team on 27 January, which, after 5 years, has renewed the accusation against Damascus that the Syrian Arab Air Force carried out the chemical weapons attack on Duma. In April of 2018, Damascus was accused of a chemical attack against civilians in the city of Duma, resulting in illegal U.S. military strikes against Syrian government positions. This was despite the fact that Syria had welcomed an OPCW fact-finding mission to inspect the alleged site of the attack. A year later, WikiLeaks revealed that OPCW had suppressed the initial results of the fact-finding mission deployed to Syria, results which suggested that the incident was in fact staged. That same year, a Mint Press News report revealed that several journalists from a number of mainstream agencies had come to the conclusion that the Duma attack was staged with the help of the White Helmets, a criminal organization posing as the Syrian Civil Defense. This was initially brought to light by a whistleblower from within the OPCW. In 2021, during a visit to Duma, the Gray Zone reporter Aaron Mate referred to the 2018 incident as one of the biggest pro-war hoaxes since Iraq. Since 2013, armed groups in Syria have attempted to pin chemical attacks on the government in attempts to instigate internationally led regime change operations against it. This comes in the form of staged attacks or actual false flag chemical attacks, which leave many dead and are designed to implicate Damascus, as was the case in Ghouta in 2013 and in Khan Sheikhoun in 2017. The latest OPCW report comes as Washington is desperately trying to obstruct the reconciliation process currently underway between the Syrian and Turkish governments. And this is part of an article from the Gray Zone, published on February 3rd by Aaron Mate. In Duma cover-up, OPCW's new smoking gun backfires. In a new phase of multi-year cover-ups, the OPCW has accused, or of a multi-year cover-up, the OPCW has accused Syria of a chemical attack in Duma. But to make the case, the OPCW breaks its own rules and offers an argument that its own findings undermine. In the latest chapter of an international cover-up scandal, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, OPCW, has directly accused Syria of committing a deadly chemical attack in the town of Duma. A new report from the Chemical Watchdog's Investigation and Identification Team, IIT, alleges that Syrian forces dropped 2 chlorine gas cylinders and killed 43 civilians on April 7, 2018. The report received an immediate and unequivocal endorsement from the U.S. Department of State, the British Foreign Office, and French Foreign Ministry, the diplomatic branches of the countries that rushed to bomb Syria in response to the events in Douma. The IIT's conclusion follows years of refusal by OPCW leaders to account for the suppression of the Douma probe's initial findings. The OPCW's first report, finalized in June 2018 by a separate fact-finding mission, raised doubts that a chemical attack occurred in Douma. It also left open the possibility that the incident was staged, presumably by insurgents who controlled the area at the time. Leaked documents reveal that this original report was doctored, and along with it, other critical material concealed from public view. The following month, a delegation of U.S. officials lobbied the FFM team to conclude that chlorine gas was used as a weapon in Douma, and that the Syrian government was responsible. A follow-up report released in March 2019 omitted the original's key findings and endorsed the U.S.-led narrative of a chlorine attack. The manipulation of the Douma probe was challenged by OPCW inspectors who developed to Syria for the mission. OPCW inspectors who deployed to Syria for the mission. OPCW Director General Fernando Arias has refused to meet with them or address their concerns. The US, UK, and France have declared that the IIT report refutes the Russian claim that insurgents faked the use of poison gas use in Douma to frame the Syrian government. They also touted what they call the independent, unbiased, and expert work of the OPCW staff. Yet, the IIT report fails to address the concerns of the dissenting OPCW staffers who originally investigated the Douma incident. It doesn't resolve the identified suppression, inconsistencies, and errors across key areas of the probe, including toxicology, chemical analysis, ballistics, witness testimony. Instead, after burying the original findings and stonewalling calls for accountability, the OPCW has doubled down on the deception in Douma. The first installment of the Gray Zone's review of the IIT Douma report focuses on the core investigative pillar of chemical analysis, which heavily factors in the IIT's conclusion. And so that's a portion of that article. You can read the rest of it at the Gray Zone. And these are the findings by wikileaks.org. OPCW whistleblower panel on the Douma attack of April 2018. Today, WikiLeaks publishes a statement made by a panel that listened to testimony and reviewed evidence from a whistleblower from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons last week to accompany this statement. WikiLeaks is also publishing a previously leaked engineering assessment of the alleged chemical attack in Douma, Syria, on April 7th last year. This assessment was omitted in the final report by the OPCW, which does not support its findings. WikiLeaks editor Kristen Raffson took part in the panel to review the testimony and documents from the OPC whistleblower. He says the panel was presented with evidence that cast doubt on the integrity of the OPCW. Although the whistleblower was not ready to step forward and or present documents to the public, WikiLeaks believes it's now of utmost interest for the public to see everything that was collected by the fact-finding mission on Douma and all scientific reports written in relation to the investigation. We call out to people within the OPCW to leak these documents securely to us via wikileaks.org/#submit. One of the panel members was Dr. Jose Bustani, the first Director General of the OPCW, who concluded that the convincing evidence of irregular behavior in the OPCW investigation of the alleged Douma chemical attack confirms doubts and suspicions I already had. I could make no sense of what I was reading in the international press. Even official reports of investigations seemed incoherent at best. The picture is certainly clearer now, although very disturbing. In support of the OPCW's original objectives, the panel called upon the organization to re-establish its credibility and legitimacy by allowing all inspectors who took part in the Duma investigation to come forward and report their differing observations in an appropriate form of the states parties to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And this is an internal OPCW email. He says, the Organization of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons sent a team of experts to investigate allegations that a chemical attack took place in the Syrian city of Duma on the 7th of April 2018. The author of the email was a member of the team and claims the redacted preliminary version of the report misrepresents the facts he and his colleagues discovered on the ground. The email is dated 22nd of June. It's addressed to Robert Fairweather, Chief of Cabinet, and forwarded to his deputy, Amir Shuket, and members of the fact-finding mission to Duma. He says this misrepresentation was achieved by selective omission, introducing a bias which undermines the credibility of the report. Further, it's claimed that crucial facts that have remained in the redacted version have morphed into something quite different to what was originally drafted. This is said to have been done at the behest of the Office of the Director General, a post that was held by Turkish diplomat Ahmet Uzumcu. At the time he has since been replaced by Spaniard Fernando Arias. The attack in question was widely attributed to the Syrian army based on reports by rebel forces that were present in Duma at the time, and this assertion was backed up by the United States, British, and French governments. These three countries carried out strikes against Syrian government targets in response on the 14th of April 2018. This was before the fact-finding team had gained access to the site in Duma. The mission there was delayed for nearly 2 weeks by entrenched fighters and subsequent clashes between the fighters and government forces that moved into the area. Upon arrival, the team found much of the physical evidence, including the bodies of the deceased, was no longer available. It was alleged that 49 had died and up to 650 had been seriously affected by weaponized chemical gas released in a specific area of Duma on that day in April. There was a claim that the gas came from cylinders dropped from the aircraft, clearly implicating Syrian government forces who had complete air superiority. The redacted report seemed to support these conclusions, but the author of the released email outlined some specific aspects of it which he considers particularly worrisome. Firstly, there's a statement in the redacted report. It states that there's sufficient evidence to determine the presence of chlorine or another reactive chlorine-containing chemical. Likely one or more chemicals that contain a reactive chlorine atom. Such chemicals could include the major ingredient of household chlorine-based bleach. Purposely singling out chlorine gas as one of the possibilities is disingenuous. The redacted reporter also removed context from a claim in the original draft which concerned the likelihood of the gas having emanated from cylinders found at the scene in Duma. The original text is said to have purposely emphasized that there was insufficient evidence to affirm this being the case. This is a major deviation from the original report, according to the author. He also cites problems with a paragraph in the redacted version which states, based on the high levels of various chlorinated organic derivatives detected in environmental samples. This is said to overstate the case according to the email. They were in most cases present only in parts per billion range, as low as 1 to 2 parts per billion, which is essentially trace quantities. One piece of evidence which was shown on news networks across the world was a video said to show victims being treated in a hospital in the aftermath of the attack in Duma. The symptoms shown were, however, not consistent with what witnesses reported seeing that day. A detailed discussion of this was apparently omitted from the redacted version of the OPC report. The email states, omitting this section of the report, including the epidemiology, which has been removed in its entirety, has a serious negative impact on the report, as this section is inextricably linked to the chemical agent identified. In this case, the confidence in the identity of chlorine or any other choking agent is drawn into question precisely because of the inconsistency with the reported and observed systems. The inconsistency was not only noted by the fact-finding mission team, but strongly supported the 3 toxicologists with expertise in exposure to chemical warfare agents. Yet another point of contention is the placement and the condition of the cylinders reported to have contained the chemical agent. It's been alleged that their condition may not be consistent with having been dropped from the air compared to damaged in the immediate surrounding area. This was discussed in an unreleased engineering report from OPCW that was leaked and WikiLeaks published in October 2019, and it indicates it's unlikely the cylinders were airdropped. See previous release OPCW whistleblower panel on the Dune attack of April 2018. Sections discussing this are largely absent from the redacted report. This information was important in assessing the likelihood of the presence of toxic chemicals versus the use of toxic chemicals, states the email. The author ends his letter with an appeal to the management to allow him to attach his differing observations to the document. The annual conference of the states parties of the OPCW, that is composed of representatives of all member states of the convention, starts Monday, 25th. Amongst the releases on October 2019 is a memorandum written by, or in protest by, one of the scientists sent on a fact-finding mission to investigate the attack. It's dated 14 March 2019 and it's addressed to Fernando Arias, Director General of the organization. This was exactly 2 weeks after the organization published its final report on the Duma investigation. WikiLeaks is also releasing the original preliminary report for the first time along with the redacted version. The aforementioned memo states that around 20 experts or inspectors have expressed concerns over the final FFM report, which they feel didn't reflect the views of the team members that deployed to Duma. Only one member of the fact-finding team that went to Duma, a paramedic, is said to have contributed to the final version of the report. Apart from that, one person, an entirely new team, was gathered to assemble the final report, referred to as the FFM core team. The new team was staffed with people who had only operated in country X, according to the memorandum. It's not clear what country that refers to, except that it's presumably not Syria. It's possible, though, only speculation that country X refers to Turkey, as OPCW has sent teams into refugee camps there to interview survivors from Duma. The author of the memorandum states that he was the one originally tasked with analysis and assessment of the 2 cylinders found on the scene of the alleged chemical attack. This was the task he undertook in the understanding he was clearly the most qualified team member, having been to the location in Duma, and because of his expertise in metallurgy, chemical engineering, including pressure vessel design, artillery, and defense R&D. He continues, in subsequent weeks, I found that I was being excluded from the work for reasons not made clear. The author explains that he'd frequently asked to be updated on the progress of the final report and to be allowed to review the draft, but was turned down on both counts. The response was utmost secrecy. Once the final report was released on the 1st of March 2019, it became clear that the conclusions of the report had changed significantly in the hands of the new core team that had assembled its final form. At the conclusion of the in-country activities in the Syrian Arab Republic, the consensus within the FF team was that there were indications of serious inconsistencies and findings. After the exclusion of all team members other than a small cadre of members who had deployed again in October 2018 to country X, the conclusion seems to have turned completely in the opposite direction. The FFM team members find this confusing and are concerned to know how this occurred. Towards the end of the memo, he writes in conclusion, I must stress that I hold no opinion, interest, or strong views on the technical part of the matter, nor any interest in the political outcomes. My interest is in sound technical rigor. The science, engineer, and facts will speak for themselves. And the last portion, part 4, One of the documents is an email exchange dated 27 and 28 February between members of the fact-finding mission deployed to Duma and the senior officials of the OPCW. It includes an email from Sebastian Braha, Chief of Cabinet at the OPCW, where he instructs that an engineering report from Ian Henderson should be removed from the security registry of the organization. Please get this document out of Documents Registry Archive, and please remove all traces, if any, of its delivery, storage, whatever, in DRA. The main finding of Henderson, who inspected the sites in Duma and 2 cylinders that were found on the site of the alleged attack, was that they were more likely manually placed there than dropped from a plane or helicopter from considerable heights. His findings were omitted from the official final OPCW report on the Duma incident. Another document released today is minutes from a meeting on 6 June 2018 where 4 staff members of the OPCW had discussions with 3 toxicologists, clinical pharmacologists, 1 bioanalytical and toxicological chemists, all specialists in chemical weapons according to the minutes. The purpose of this meeting was twofold. The first objective was to solicit expert advice on the value of exhuming suspected victims of the alleged chemical attack in Duma on 7 April 2018. According to the minutes, the OPCW team was advised by the experts that there would be little use in conducting exhumations. The second point was to elicit expert opinions from the forensic toxicologists regarding the observed and reported symptoms of the alleged victims. More specifically, whether the symptoms observed in victims were consistent with the exposure to chlorine or other reactive chlorine gas. According to the minutes leaked today, with respect to the consistency of the observed and reported symptoms of the alleged victims with possible exposure to chlorine gas or similar, the experts were conclusive in their statement that there was no correlation between symptoms and chlorine exposure. The OPCW team members wrote that the key takeaway message from the meeting was that the symptoms observed were inconsistent with exposure to chlorine and no other obvious candidate chemical causing the symptoms could be identified. The third document is a copy of OPCW email exchanges from 20 to 28 August 2018, discussing the meeting with toxicologists. The fourth document is an email exchange from the end of July 2018, where it stated that the 8 OPCW inspectors deployed to Duma during the fact-finding mission should be excluded from the discussions on the project. So there we have it. That's the WikiLeaks portion. And then from First Post we have an article entitled West Using Chemical Weapons Watchdog to Justify Its Aggression Against Syrian Government, says Russia. Russia's permanent representative to the OPCW has claimed that the latest report by the chemical watchdog accusing Syria of carrying out chemical attack in Duma in 2018 seems to be a political hit piece meant to justify the West's continued military aggression against the Syrian government. Russia's permanent representative to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons has claimed that the latest report by the chemical watchdog accusing Syria of carrying out chemical attack in Duma in 2018 seems to be a political hit piece meant to justify the West's continued military aggression against the Syrian government. Alexander Shulgin vehemently dismissed the report, which was released in January by the Investigation and Identification Team, the IIT. Dismissing the IIT as completely illegitimate, Shulgin, while speaking to Russia Today, claimed the group's creation was pushed through by the U.S. and its allies in order to undermine the core principles of the OPCW and international law, replacing them with their own made-up rules. The IIT's report, according to Shulgin, is riddled with inconsistencies and factual gaps and barely holds together. Furthermore, none of Russia's or any other country's uncomfortable questions regarding the details of the IIT's findings were even remotely addressed during an OPCW briefing on the report, the ambassador told Russia Today, noting that the reporter highlighted the double standards currently present within the OPCW. He said that when Russia presented evidence of a chemical attack in Aleppo back in 2016, every minute detail of Moscow's findings were heavily scrutinized by the organization. However, when it comes to the attack in Duma, OPCW officials seem to turn a blind eye to basic questions such as how and when the evidence was gathered and presented during the investigation, he added. For instance, they refer to the fact that some new sample has appeared provided by third party. What is the third party? Nothing is said about it. They just say, trust us. Shulgin was quoted as saying by Russia Today, noting that the sample in question had never been reported on in previous investigations. So before there was no sample, but now suddenly it somehow appeared. Without any explanations, the ambassador added, suggesting its sudden appearance can only be explained by the need for the US, France, and UK to escape international accountability from their aggression against Syria. What's in the report? The OPCW report finds reasonable grounds exist to believe the Syrian government was responsible for a chemical weapons attack that killed 43 civilians in the suburban town on Dune in 2018. The organization's senior official told the Security Council on Tuesday. According to the report, Fernando Arias, Director General of the UN-backed OPCW, said there's evidence that on 7 April 2018, at least one Syria Air Force helicopter operating under the control of the government's Tiger forces departed Duma Air Base and dropped 2 yellow chlorine cylinders, hitting 2 residential buildings. According to the report, 3 NATO states launched a series of airstrikes against civilian and military targets in Syria in April 2018, after the so-called White Helmets, an NGO operating in so-called rebel-controlled areas of Syria, published a series of videos supposedly showing the aftermath of a chlorine attack on the residents of Duma. Syria has vehemently denied any responsibility for the incident, and both Damascus and Moscow have repeatedly pointed to evidence, including testimonies from alleged victims, that suggests the incident was staged in order to justify a Western attack. And this is from independent.co.uk. In the very early spring of last year, I gave a lecture to European military personnel interested in the Middle East. It was scarcely a year since Bashar al-Assad's alleged use of chlorine gas against the civilian inhabitants of the Damascus suburb of Duma on 7 April 2018, in which 43 people were said to have been killed. Few present had much doubt that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which represents 193 member states around the world, would soon confirm in a final report that Assad was guilty of a war crime, which had been condemned by Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, and Theresa May. But at the end of my talk, a young NATO officer who specializes in chemical weapons, he was not British, sought me out for a private conversation. The OPCW are not going to admit all they know, he said. They've already censored their own documents. I could not extract any more from him. He smiled and walked away, leaving me to guess what he was talking about. If NATO had doubts about the OPCW, this was a very serious matter. When it published its final report in March 2019, the OPCW said that the testimony, environmental and biomedical samples, and toxicological and ballistic analyses provided reasonable grounds that the use of toxic chemical had taken place in Duma, which contained reactive chlorine. The US, Britain, and France, which launched missile attacks on Syrian military sites in retaliation for Duma before any investigation had taken place, thought themselves justified the OPCW's report was splashed across headlines around the world, to the indignation of Russia, Assad's principal military ally, which denied the validity of the publication. Then in mid-May 2019 came news of a confidential report by OPCW South African ballistics inspector Ian Henderson, a document which the organization excluded from its final report, which took issue with the organization's conclusions. Canisters supposedly containing chlorine gas may not have been dropped by Syrian helicopters, it suggested, and could have been placed at the site of the attack by unknown hands. So the idea that the canisters were dropped from a plane is in question, and the idea that there was chlorine used and that a chlorine affected the people that were in the area that supposedly died on that day is in question. by way of WikiLeaks and Aaron Monte and independent.co.uk, it seems. Peter Hitchens of the Mail on Sunday reported in detail on the Henderson document. No other mainstream media followed up this story. The BBC, for example, had reported in full on the OPCW's final report of the use of chlorine gas, but never mentioned the subsequent Henderson story. And here I might myself have abandoned the trail had I not received a call on my Beirut phone shortly after the Henderson paper from the NATO officer who had tipped me off about the OPCW's apparent censorship of its own documents. I wasn't talking about the Henderson report, he said abruptly, and immediately terminated our conversation, but now I understand what he must have been talking about. For over the past few weeks, there's emerged deeply disturbing new evidence that the OPCW went far further than merely excluding one dissenting voice from its conclusions on the 2018 Duma attack. The most recent information published on WikiLeaks is in a report from Hitchens again and from Jonathan Still, a former senior foreign correspondent for The Guardian, suggests that the OPCW suppressed or failed to publish or simply preferred to ignore the conclusions of up to 20 other members of its staff who became so upset at what they regarded as the misleading conclusions of their final report that they officially sought to have it changed in order to represent the truth. The OPCW has said in a number of statements that it stands by its final reports. At first, senior OPCW officials contented themselves by merely acknowledging the Henderson's reports, the existence a few days after it appeared, without making any comment on its contents. When the far more damaging later reports emerged in early November, Fernando Arias, the OPCW's Director General, said that it was in the nature of any thorough inquiry for individuals in the team to express subjective views. While some of the views continue to circulate in some public discussion forums, I would like to reiterate that I stand by the independent professional conclusion of the investigation. The OPCW declined to respond to questions from Hitchens or Steele. But the new details suggest that the other evidence could have been left unpublished by the OPCW. These were not just from leaked emails, but given by an OPCW inspector, a colleague of Henderson, who was one of a team of 8 to visit Duma, and who appeared at a briefing in Brussels last month to explain his original findings to a group of disarmament, legal, medical, and intelligence personnel. As Steele reported afterwards in a piece published by Counterpunch in mid-November 2019, the inspector, who gave his name to his audience but asked to be called Alex, said he didn't want to undermine the OPCW, but stated that most of the Duma team felt the 2 reports on the incident the OPCW had also published an interim report in 2018 were scientifically impoverished, procedurally irregular, and possibly fraudulent. Alex said he sought in vain to have a subsequent OPCW conference to address these concerns and demonstrate transparency, impartiality, and independence.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
From Tasnim News Agency, the West justifies its aggression by using chemical weapons watchdog Moscow. This is from February 8th. Russia's permanent representative to the OPCW, Alexander Shulgin, said the latest report accusing Damascus of carrying out a chemical attack in Duma in 2018 appears to be a political hit piece meant to justify the West's continued military aggression against the Syrian government. Shulgin vehemently dismissed the report by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which was produced in late January by the so-called Investigation and Identification Team, IIT. In an interview with RT, calling the IIT completely illegitimate, he claimed the group's creation was pushed through by the U.S. and its allies in order to determine the core principles to undermine the core principles of the OPCW and international law, and replace them with their own made-up rules. The IIT's report, according to Shulgin, is riddled with inconsistencies and factual gaps, and barely holds together. Furthermore, none of Russia's or any other country's uncomfortable questions regarding the details of the IIT's findings were even remotely addressed during an OPCW briefing on the report, the ambassador said. Shulgin also noted that the report highlighted the double standards currently present within the OPCW. When Russia presented evidence of a chemical attack in Aleppo back in 2016, every minute detail of Moscow's findings was heavily scrutinized by the organization, he said, However, when it comes to the attack in Duma, OPCW officials seem to turn a blind eye to basic questions such as how and when the evidence was gathered and presented during the investigation.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
For instance, they refer to the fact that some new sample has appeared provided by a third party. What is the third party? Nothing is said about it. They just say, "Trust us," said Shulgin, noting that the sample in question had never been reported on in previous investigations. So, before there was no sample, but now, suddenly, it somehow appeared without any explanations. The ambassador stressed, suggesting its sudden appearance can only be explained by the need for the US, France, and UK to escape international accountability for the aggression against Syria. The three NATO states launched a series of airstrikes against civilian and military targets in Syria in April 2018 after the so-called White Helmets, an NGO operating in quote-unquote rebel-controlled areas of Syria, published a series of videos supposedly showing the aftermath of a chlorine attack on the residents of Duma. Syria has vehemently denied any responsibility for the incident, and both Damascus and Moscow have repeatedly pointed to evidence, including testimonies from alleged victims, that suggest the incident was staged in order to justify a Western attack. And here's Vanessa Bealey on the issue.
That you had an Andrew Mitchell
video. Yes, you wanted to quote Andrew Mitchell, so let's have a look at what Andrew Mitchell had to say on Newsnight a night or two ago.
Okay.
One crossing that's open, that's all as a result of the Russian and Chinese veto. And we've spoken tonight to Martin Griffiths, the head of UN OCHA, to ask what we're going to do. We need to get these other crossings open. And the one that was open, partly because of border restrictions, but also because of the effects of the earthquake, is now shut. So this one route of getting stuff through to northern Syria is currently closed.
Britain's response to the immediate challenge? To help the one organisation that is operating on the ground.
Britain has funded the White Helmets, which during the war were a sort of civil defence unit. But they are the first responders on the ground there, and we are looking at giving them more support so that they can put fuel in their vehicles.
Right. So what I've actually been told by sources with contacts inside USA is that the UK and the US right now see this as an opportunity to repair the tarnished reputation of the White Helmets, who of course were very much discredited, particularly by their role in staging events during the alleged Duma chemical attack.
What is this nothing you talk about?
Fraudulent witness statements to the OPCW team. And of course, the OPCW has been completely discredited by the dissident inspectors who have exposed the various reports, including the latest identification and investigation team report, which is attributed blame to the Syrian government. Basically, the inspectors demonstrated that the OPCW was being influenced to produce the results that were effectively fraudulent and covering up the crimes of the UK, US, and France that bombed Damascus on the basis of the claim of chemical weapon use. So here we have the US aid Administrator Samantha Power's calls regarding the response to the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, and mirroring the language that we're hearing from UK officials in a call with Raed al-Salah, head of the Syria Civil Defense, also known as White Helmets, and a long-standing US aid partner. Administrator Power reiterated US aid support for the people of Syria and offered condolences for the lives lost. Let's have a look. People who followed the Syria war from the beginning will know our work on exposing the White Helmets, let's say, Oscar-winning performances in their PR complex that was producing these reports to effectively present the White Helmets as Nobel Peace Prize nominees. Let's have a look at this video, Mike.
Of course, Vanessa, one of the most famous photographs from the Syrian campaign, the Syrian war, was Dusty Boy, but somehow that boy seems to have come out with no dust on him whatsoever, Patrick.
Clean as a whistle. And when he was saying tack beer, he wasn't talking about let's go to the pub and celebrate. Okay, these are hardcore jihadists.
Yes. So
and I mean, extraordinary, because presumably this boy would have been buried since, what was it, 4 a.m. On Monday morning. And yet, as you point out, he emerges perfectly clean and perfectly...
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
It's quite clear that he knows the people who have dug him out and that he thinks this is a great game. Of course, this is also in keeping with the tsunami of videos that we used to see from when the White Helmets got involved in producing the propaganda in Syria to defend the armed groups and to maintain the idea or the myth of them being moderate rebels. So let's look at how much the US is pledging: 85 million for Turkey, Syria earthquake relief. And the other point that I wanted to make, of course, that the various handlers of the White Helmets have been trying desperately to renew their image with their connection to Ukraine. You know, there has been a huge amount of propaganda linking the White Helmets to the paramedic efforts in Ukraine and trying to basically put them back in the limelight, and it's been failing. And what we've seen in the media is an actual obfuscation of the White Helmet brand. We've seen them stating the Syria Civil Defense, or simply saying witnesses or sources in Idlib have been describing various events there. But now what we see is a flood of White Helmet references in colonial media. So 85 million is going into Idlib, only to Idlib, this little corner of northwest Syria that is controlled by the US and UK assets, including, as I keep saying, Al-Qaeda under various rebrands currently, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So 85 million for Turkey and US partner organizations in Syria. So that makes it even clearer. And then let's have a look here at some of the propaganda that is now starting to come out as a result of this White Helmet rebranding, or this White Helmet renewal process. So here you have a headline one day ago in The Independent, which has been basically copy-pasted by the majority of the pro-NATO media. Heinous bombing of areas hit by earthquake by Assad's forces. Alicia Kearns, who is the Foreign Office Committee Chairman, Mike, sorry, I've slightly forgotten. Statement came after rescue teams from the White Helmets issued a letter to leaders urging them to pressure Damascus to ensure there is no bombing in the affected areas. So, of course, armed groups are not taking advantage of the humanitarian tragedy and launching drones, which is what I discovered when I spoke to military contacts in this area. I was told that the armed groups had launched various drones, and that the Syrian Arab Army Air Defense had launched a defense against those and brought the drones down. That was actually what this event was all about. Of course, that is not investigated, and it's not even mentioned by mainstream media, including the BBC, that also ran with this story. So Foreign Secretary James Cleverly also criticized the Assad regime. So we're back into that kind of lexicon for the completely unacceptable bombing of Morea in the wake of the natural disaster. Morea, by the way, is under the control of Al-Qaeda and has been for some time. Then, as I mentioned, who's to say that the armed groups are not taking advantage of a humanitarian disaster to launch attacks and to move forward? On the basis, of course, that there had been a lot of talk of liberation of the area around the M4 that had been controlled by Russia and Turkey for some time. And here we see ISIS militants take advantage of massive earthquake to mount prison break. Now, the Raju prison near Afrin in northern Syria is actually under control of the Turkish intelligence. Also interesting that Turkey has recently been talking about a rapprochement with President Assad, and northern Syria now threatened by floods following deadly earthquake. Let's have a look at the content. Both these articles, by the way, are from The Cradle, so people can go and check them out, and the links will be in the show notes. So just taking from this article very quickly, countless winter crops in the Hasaka countryside, so that's the northeast, were flooded and potentially destroyed, threatening food security in Syria, which is already at risk due mainly to US occupation of the northeast and of wheat and barley resources and oil resources. And it's worth also mentioning here that most Syrians have said, well, we don't care about the sanctions. We don't need Western humanitarian response. We actually just want them to get out of Syria so that we have access to our resources. So the flooding of these tributaries, which is going on now, comes in the midst of a crisis across northern Syria, which has been caused by, according to many experts, by Ankara's monopolization and weaponization of water accessibility, given that most of these river branches originate in Turkish territory. Since 2019, Turkey has been cutting off water supply to 2 million civilians in northeast Syria. There is speculation that the Turkish dams and artificial lakes built by Ankara on the Euphrates River may have caused the earthquake. Ibrahim Saeed, a geography professor at Damascus University, said following the quake that the huge amount of water in the Ataturk Dam caused the earthquake, which collected 48 billion cubic meters of Euphrates water. This dam, he says, is a violation of nature and of the water rights of Iraq and Syria. There is a history of Turkey orchestrating famine both in Iraq and in Syria through the restriction of water supply. Deputy Director of Iraq's Seismological Center, Hasnain Jassim, Turkey has built 2,000 dams, reservoirs, and artificial lakes, some of which are near the epicenter of the earthquake. This is one of the reasons for the activation of the earth. Of course, it is also interesting. I mean, there are going to be many conspiracy theories concerning the cause of the earthquake.
Further relating to the subject at hand, Iran questions credibility of chemical watchdog Syria report. Iran's UN mission questions the credibility of a report issued by the World Chemical Watchdog that accuses Syria of an alleged 2018 chemical attack against the Arab country's own people. The report was issued by the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, so-called Investigation and Identification Team, last month. It alleged that there were reasonable grounds to believe that at least one Syrian Air Force helicopter had dropped 2 cylinders of toxic gas on the town of Duma near the Syrian capital during the so-called incident. Damascus has strongly denounced and rejected the allegations as completely lacking in all scientific and objective evidentiary basis.
We have the evidence. No one can dispute the evidence. We heard the evidence. We saw the evidence.
Amir Saeed Eravani, Iran's permanent ambassador to the UN, echoed Syria's condemnation, addressing a United Nations Security Council gathering on Tuesday. The report, similar to the previous ones that had been issued by the OPCW about the alleged incident, is based on unauthorized sources, lacks the necessary legal conclusion, and has been prepared irrespective of the Syrian government observations, the envoy added. Iravani said the same Western countries that either supported or stayed silent towards the former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's systematic deployment of chemical weapons against Iran during Saddam's 1980 to 1988 war against the Islamic Republic, had manipulated the OPCW and its subsidiary mechanisms into compiling the report against Syria so they can advance their political goals concerning the country. He said the Western states were staging a premeditated scenario against Syria. The Islamic Republic is deeply concerned about exploitation and politicization of the OPCW, Iravani noted, saying manipulation of the organization in such a way worked to dent its credibility. Group details, OPCW cover-up in Duma chemical attack. The alleged chemical attack reportedly hit the Syrian town on April 7, 2018. We've gone over that. And the so-called incident on the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. A week later, the United States, Britain, and France launched a coordinated missile attack against sites and research facilities near Damascus and the western Syrian city of Homs, with the purported goal of paralyzing the Syrian government's capability to produce chemicals. Syria surrendered its stockpile of chemical weapons in 2014 to a joint mission led by the United States and OPCW, which oversaw the destruction of the weaponry. Damascus has repeatedly asserted that no chemical attack had happened on the town at the time, and the incident had been staged by foreign intelligence agencies to pressure the Syrian government at a time when it was making significant advances against foreign-backed territories across the Arab country's soil. The Syrian government also says it believes that the incident was staged by the White Helmets, a Western and Israeli-backed group, which claims to be a humanitarian NGO, but has long been accused of working with anti-Damascus terrorists and staging false flag gas attacks. And this is from mintpressnews.com. As mainstream journalists acknowledged Duma attacks were staged, the humanitarian Syria regime change networks tries to save a sinking ship. Over the past few, and this is from 2019 if I'm not mistaken, over the past few days, notable journalists and other figures in mainstream media have acknowledged that the alleged chemical weapons attack that occurred last April in Damascus suburb of Duma, so it's 2018, Syria, was likely staged by activist groups such as the Helmets. Their comments and investigations have largely vindicated the many journalists and academics who cast aspersions on the precipitous Western media campaign to blame that alleged attack on the Syrian government. Many of the dissenting voices were derided as conspiracy theorists or ignored entirely by mainstream sources, yet now that these revelations are being voiced by acceptable figures in mainstream media, those who have built their careers on promoting the White Helmets and regime change in Syria are working to discredit these new dissenting voices. Among those on the counterattack are individuals connected to the oligarch-funded humanitarian regime change network that was the subject of a recent Mint Press expose. The alleged Duma attack, notably used as a justification for a military attack launched against Syria by the US and the UK and France, returned to the news cycle earlier this month following a report from James Harkin, a journalist who has written for The Guardian, Harper's, and the Financial Times. It's currently the director of the Center for Investigative Journalism. Harkin's report, which was published in The Intercept, cast doubt on the prevailing mainstream narrative surrounding the events that occurred in Duma last April. Harkin, in visiting Duma and the surrounding area, confirmed past reports by other independent journalists that no sarin gas had been used, which was also confirmed by the OPCW interim report, and claimed that the scenes filmed at the medical point in Duma, which were widely circulated by the mainstream media as evidence that a chemical weapon attack had occurred, had likely been staged. Harkin lamented the staging of the hospital scenes as a casualty of Syria's propaganda war. Elements of Harkin's rather rambling report were rapidly corroborated by BBC producer Riyam Daladi, who revealed on Twitter that he had proof after a 6-month investigation that those same hospital scenes had been staged. Daladi had previously been the cause of some consternation among the pro-regime change pundits when he had tweeted immediately after the alleged Duma chemical attack that he was sick and tired of activists and so-called rebels using the corpses of dead children to stage emotive scenes for Western consumption. Daladi was referring to the image of 2 children wrapped in a last hug that went viral on social media, eliciting sympathy for the chemical attack narrative. Talati pointed out that the two children had been photographed on separate floors in the building before being artfully arranged into the last hug, positioned by the producers of the scene, which was picked up by the majority of corporate media and used to give the impression that the Syrian Arab army had used chemical weapons against their own civilians as they were concluding final amnesty negotiations with Jaish al-Islam, the extremist group then occupying Douma. Shortly after deleting the aforementioned tweet, Talati protected his Twitter account by reiterating his observations in a less inflammatory tweet, while explaining that his first tweet had been correctly deemed in breach of BBC editorial policy through use of sick and tired, and by not providing context. Talati had notably been a member of the production team of the notorious September 2013 BBC Panorama documentary Saving Syria's Children, a report that was forensically investigated by independent researcher Robert Stewart, who concluded that the sequences filmed by BBC personnel and others at Atareb Hospital, Aleppo on 26/18/2013, purporting to show the aftermath of an incendiary bomb attack on a nearby school, are largely, if not entirely, staged. So Talati, no stranger to controversy, appears to have once more broken with the ranks of mainstream media by admitting that the White Helmet chemical attack scenes in Douma Medical Point were without a doubt staged. One might ask why it took Talati 6 months of investigation to arrive at the same conclusion as acclaimed journalist Robert Fisk and other on-the-ground journalists did just days after the attack occurred. At the time, those journalists had been labeled by Talati and others as conspiracy theorists. However, the recent statements made by Talati and Harkin's recent reports have hardly created a consensus regarding the alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma with the mainstream media. Instead, much the opposite has happened with the journalists and experts who have linked their professional reports to the credibility of groups like the US-UK incubated and financed White Helmets now going on in the offensive in an effort to trivialize the recent revelations regarding the events of April 7, 2018. Following the renewed interest in the Douma incident as a result of Harkin's report and Talati's subsequent tweets, Tobias Schneider, a research fellow at the Global Public Policy Institute, accused people like Harkin and Talati of squabbling over the intricacies of the alleged chemical attacks in Douma, later calling these independent investigations and statements madness. We must presume that Schneider's Twitter accusation would also be directed at genuinely independent journalists and academics who presented evidence to counter the dominant Douma narratives produced by the usual suspects in corporate media and groups like the White Helmets affiliated to Jaish al-Islam, the brutal armed group in control of Douma. Among those are journalists who actually visited Douma immediately after the attack: Vanessa Beeley, Eva Bartlett, Robert Fisk of The Independent, Uli Gach from ZDF, Germany, and Pearson Sharp of OAN, One American News Network. Also potentially in Schneider's crosshairs are the members of the Working Group on Syria, Propaganda Media, WGSPM, established by Professor Piers Robinson, who produced an extensive briefing scrutinizing the media anomalies in the Douma attack. Unwilling to stop there, Schneider also announced that the GPPI would be publishing the first analytical study on the logical underpinning the Syrian regime's systematic use of improvised chlorine bombs in particular that would use the broadcast data set compilable and break down tactical operational strategic patterns in order to claim, despite a lack of evidence for chemical weapons use in Douma last year, or other separate incidents form a pattern that would incriminate the Syrian government in the events alleged to have taken place last April.
The whole notion of logic.
The report's now been published and it's been picked up by the usual purveyors and promoters of the chemical attack, narratives that are designed to criminalize the Syrian government. A look into Schneider's background in the organization that employs him hardly paints a picture of an objective observer of the evidence surrounding this hot-button issue. Quite the contrary. Schneider and the GPPI are directly connected to the humanitarian regime change network that was exposed in a recent MemPress series for its efforts to exploit the death of the late MP Joe Cox in order to manufacture consent for regime change in Syria and whitewash both the UK government connections to the White Helmets and the White Helmets' own troubling track record in facilitating and even directly committing war crimes. And here's a briefing regarding the white helmets UN briefing.
Report that was just released. Yes, there will be. So are we ready? Good afternoon, colleagues. Sorry for the delay. Let me open the joint press conference of the Syrian Arab Republic and the Russian Federation. We have Russian Ambassador Nebenzia and Ambassador Bassam Sabah here. And we are starting with the remarks of Russian Ambassador. Ambassador, you have the floor. Thank you, Fyodor. Once again, I apologize for being too late and keeping you too long. I spoke too much today already, so I will not be repeating myself. You know the reason why we called this press conference. This report that was just released, which we, as I said, do not recognize, like we are not recognizing the IIT itself, do not support this structure. Its members are not even chemists. Look at the irony of this. They are just legal prosecutors appointed to rubber stamp fake reports. From its very establishment, the main purpose of the IIT has apparently been to whitewash the illegal acts of aggression against Syria in April 2017 and 2018. Instead of conducting genuine investigations, this team of so-called experts merely reduced itself to retranslating ungrounded accusations of some states. As for the methodology, the investigations of the OPCW Technical Secretariat are often based on the information from open sources without even getting to the site of events that they analyze. Their conclusions cannot stand any criticism and abound in false assertions which are put forward without any respect to the main principle of OPCW investigations, the chain of custody, which is not observed, has not been observed in all the recent investigations that were conducted. I will not be repeating myself too much because I already spoke in detail during the Council's meeting. I think that what I'll do, I'll give the floor to my colleague, Ambassador Bassam Sabah, to add a few words, and then I understand you will show a short video.
Thank you very much, Vasily. Thank you all for attending this press conference. It's very clear that Ambassador Nebenzia elaborates on the aspects related to the issues of the what's called the IIT report. In my statements before the Council, I also emphasize on many aspects, but let me here highlight two of them. First, the issue of legitimacy. This team established in a very illegitimate way. Half of the members of the OPCW, 82 out of 193, voted for this. Many countries voted against or abstained or absent from voting. So
these are facts, they're numbers. You can quantify this. These are facts. These are facts. These are facts. They're numbers. You can quantify this.
Happened in the OPCW for the first time. Second, the methodology of work. The IIT basically follows the same wrong methodology of work which was used by the fact-finding mission. And mainly, Ambassador Nebenzia mentioned the issue of gathering or taking the samples and maintaining the chain of custody. According to the CWC, this has to be done by the inspectors and has to be maintained from the time where they collected until it's reached the laboratories, designated laboratories by the OPCWs. This did not happen in the case of Duma. They received
what I'm hearing is there are recurring instances of like a lack of scientific integrity here. So the investigations themselves, it's not to say that these scientific standards weren't upheld, but the reports themselves don't include that, which is a very important point.
These samples, from whom we don't know, who collected we don't know, and from where we don't know. So this is something very, very important. I wanted to show you some of the testimonies in a documentary we prepared from the people of Duma. Have this number in the reports, but no one have anything about them. So please.
Thank you, Theodore. Alan Bulkati from Russian news agency RIA Novosti. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you for doing this briefing. I have two questions, please. The first one is for both of you ambassadors. What particular consequences will this last IIT report entail for Syria? And the second question is for Ambassador Sabbagh, please. Given the fact that you do not consider the IIT as a legal body, how do you foresee the further cooperation with OPCW, and is there a possibility that of the withdrawal of Syria from the OPCW?
Okay. In terms of our cooperation with the OPCW, we are a very responsible member of the OPCW. We took a strategic decision to join the OPCW in 2013. We implement our obligations according to the CWC, and we are working with the technical secretariats on all aspects related to our obligations. Anything out of obligations, we are not responsible for.
On what happens next, Alan, answering your question, I don't know what will happen next. Some of our partners in the Security Council are very inventive, I know it, and what they have in mind, that's not for me to judge. They didn't share it with me. Let's see. Let's see what happens next. But again, whatever happens next will be based on a hoax report. You have to understand that.
Pamela, you go next.
Thank you so much, Fedor. Thank you, Ambassador Nebenzia. Thank you, Ambassador Sabbagh. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. My question is about your stakeout yesterday, about the crossings from Turkey to Syria with the earthquake relief. We just heard from Dujarric that the hub is still going at Bab al-Hawa, but the road is damaged. It's preventing a lot of the aid from going in. Are you considering other crossings, which many countries have called for? Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. I think I answered very clearly yesterday. I said crossline is available. Syrian government is ready to help.
Are you opening up some of this to get but
our
move 1 kilometers from where raised the issue of 2 cylinders being moved away 60 kilometers from where they are supposed to be remain. 16. Once he said 16, then another time he said 60. So why were they removed? Do you have an explanation for why they were removed?
It's very, let's say, technical aspects. When these cylinders took from the site in Duma, they kept in a storage. And then we had the request from the OPCW that they wanted to revisit and to examine these 2 cylinders. So they asked us not to do anything with it unless they finish this job. Then the team from the OPCW came and examined the cylinder. So by this, we believe that this is not requested to be maintained in the same place anymore. Then we move it to another storage, and this storage hit by Israelis attacked, and the 2 cylinders were destroyed. So the argument by the OPCW that these 2 cylinders moved to the new storage has no validity, because for the reason they asked to keep it, we implemented, they re-examined, and they visited the site where it was storage.
A quick follow-up. The report speaks about 43 people, and the names are. So 16 moved away 60 kilometers from where they are supposed to be remain. 16. So once he said 16, then another time he said 60. So why were they removed? Do you have an explanation for why they were removed?
It's very, let's say, technical aspects.
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
When these cylinders took from the site in Douma, they kept in a storage. And then we had the request from the OPCW that they wanted to revisit and to examine these 2 cylinders. So they asked us not to do anything with it unless they finish this job. Then the team from the OPCW came and examine the cylinder. So by this, we believe that this is not requested to be maintained in the same place anymore. Then we move it to another storage, and this storage hit by Israelis attacked, and the 2 cylinders were destroyed. So the argument by the OPCW that these 2 cylinders moved to the new storage has no validity, because for the reason they asked to keep it, we implemented, they re-examined, and they visited the site where it was storage.
A quick follow-up. Also the report speaks about 43 people, and the names are mentioned in the report. You said that there were no casualties or no mortalities in the incident. How come? Where did they come with the 43 names in this report, and where are the bodies?
The lady in the documentary said, my relatives, my uncle's family. She said, living in this. So after the incident, they disappeared. She said it. So if her relatives are up until now disappeared, so what we will consider this? I don't know.
Thank you so much. This is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I have two questions, one for Ambassador Nabenzia and one for the Ambassador of Syria, Sabagh. Mr. Nabenzia, 2 days ago, I think a senior Russian official, on the occasion of the speech given by Colin Powell in the Security Council on 6 February 2002, as you know, this senior official called for the follow-up investigation of the campaign of deceit that led to the invasion of Iraq. How do you gonna go ahead with this call? Are you serious about investigating the crimes and atrocities committed against the Iraqi people by the US invasion? And my question to my the Syrian ambassador, there is a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, put the two enemies, Palestinian and Israeli, were put in a cave or in a well, and they found a snake, and they have to cooperate together to save themselves. Would this incident, would this earthquake bring Syria and Turkey closer to each other, work together, and maybe reconcile in the near future? Thank you very much.
There are many things in this world left uninvestigated. And of course, the Iraqi hoax was never properly investigated. Nobody paid real responsibility for the crimes committed in Iraq. And I shall not be explaining to you why. Today, to think that there will be something like a tribunal on the Iraqi war would be a little bit unrealistic. People are busy with other things these days, but the questions remain. I mean, there are so many crimes committed which are pretended to be not existent, non-existing then at all, as if nothing had happened. This is the hypocrisy of today's world, of the world itself, and of the policies of some of our partners, including here in the Security Council.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Then Michel.
Hi, ambassadors.
The earthquake hit both of our people, Syrians and Turks. This is a very devastating humanitarian situation. And I think both people are now struggling for surviving. As for your questions, I think we made it very clear that whatever it says toward the improvement of the relations between our two countries has to be accompanied by actions on the ground. So there were some military meetings, and there were some exchange of views, and we are waiting to see tangible results on the ground. I think if we have a progress on that, you can see progress on the improvement of the relationship. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, ambassadors. This is Doja Shu with China Central Television. My questions are for Ambassador Sabagh. I just talked to my friends in Syria. He said in Aleppo it's disaster here. Too many people on the rubble, no enough fuel for heavy vehicles and efficient workers there. And I noticed that just a couple moments ago, the Foreign Ministry of Syria actually said that U.S. sanctions hinder humanitarian relief efforts in Syria. So I just want to ask your opinion on this. How would the sanction hinder the efforts there? And second, I just want to know, because you just said that you are ready to help the rebel-controlled area for the humanitarian relief. If this is the case, that the government-controlled area, you don't have enough equipment or resources, how can you ensure that you will give enough resources for the rebel-controlled area, especially for more cross-line humanitarian operations? Thank you.
Despite the fact that this press conference is designated for the issue of the report of the IIT, but I will answer your question. How these sanctions hinder
they're concerned that the government in Syria is working actively to rebuild its chemical weapons stockpile and has been doing so since 2018. I'd like to get your response to that. On cross-border aid deliveries, can you just clarify for us that is it still the Syrian government's position that any cross-border aid deliveries is a violation of your sovereignty and territorial integrity? Is that still the case after the earthquake? The UN has spoken a lot about bureaucratic and security obstacles to cross-line deliveries. So what is the government doing to facilitate deliveries, cross-line deliveries now in the wake of the earthquake? And Ambassador, while we have you, will we see peace in Ukraine in 2023?
You asked me when there'll be peace in Ukraine.
Will we see peace in Ukraine in 2023?
I hope, we all hope for peace. We all hope for them heeding to our concerns, which then see warmed up
propaganda made against Syria. So I don't think they have anything substantiate these accusations. It's part of their lies, as they used to be. For the second question, it's not his country.
Government control. How are you going to help get supplies there when you don't? Is that
questions, please. The OPCW, you will have seen previously reported on chemical weapons being used by rebel forces in Syria. Do you think that those reports by the OPCW are also a hoax?
We have plenties of informations given to the OPCW, given to the United Nations Security Council and 1540 Committee. All these informations basically ignored, never dealt with. At least, I mean, to my memory, more than 100 times we sent informations to the OPCW and to the UN regarding attempts by terrorist armed group to either use or to fabricate the use of chemical weapons. So that's one point. The second point, Syria requests investigations on 5 incidents where the terrorist armed group used chemical weapons against the Syrian Arab Republic people and army. From 2016 or 17 up until now, so 5 years, we have no result. This investigation is not achieved. This report is not concluded. So these indications give you a proof that the methodology of work in the OPCW is not working in the right directions. Why the investigations on incidents happened after 2017, Duma 2018, took place and report release, and incidents happened in 2017, reports are not released and investigations not finished. I mean, this is the questions. I mean, I don't have to judge anything. The situation is judging. The facts is judging. So let them prove to us that they work according to the correct methodologies. Today, Director General used terminology which I hear it for the first time. Highest criteria, best practices. We do not have such terminology in the CWC. The convention and its verification annexed clearly designated the steps on how you conduct investigations. And the technical secretariat has only one choice: to implement these provisions of the conventions. That's it.
And this is Bassam al-Sabag, Syrian diplomat. He's the permanent representative to the UN since November 22nd, 2022.
You say you cannot answer why they chose the Duma report. I think I can answer. Not easy, not a difficult guess, because they prepared it long. They wanted it to be something with which they could whitewash their aggression in April 2018. It was difficult, but they made it. Congratulations. But I mean, you see by yourself that it's so stitched with such bad threats that you can see it with your eyes, with your open. It's seen in every finding of that report.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
So the answer is clear: why they are not rushing to conduct investigations on reports on incidents that you were dutifully reporting them. I remember it very well. And that's all being piled in the Secretariat without any answer, without any initiative to begin investigation. Look, today I think I was lucky because I was accompanied by an eloquent host who answered most of the questions. And I think that you should be talking to Ambassador Sabag more often, and he will tell you more interesting things.
Yes, no, very well. And more news coming out of Syria. There is a GoFundMe that is refusing, or GoFundMe, the company, is refusing to fund Syria relief effort funding, and they are funding white helmets. So GoFundMe is refusing to send aid to Syria over sanctions from the U.S. Treasury despite the devastating earthquake that struck the country earlier in the week. GoFundMe, a proclaiming lead platform for fundraising, has been found to be complicit in the U.S. waged war in Syria, complying with U.S. sanctions prohibiting aid from making it to the disaster-stricken country. Several social media users went on Twitter to report on the issue after the fundraising firm suspended the fundraisers for Syria after the earthquake struck the country, with many highlighting the severe repercussions that the sanctions on Syria have been carrying for the Syrian health sector and rescue efforts. An activist, Kevork Almasian, the founder of Syriana Analysis, reported that the company temporarily suspended our crowdfunding for the people affected by the earthquake in Syria. They claimed that they wanted to ensure that the aid was going to a humanitarian organization and that it was making it to its hands. Another user posted a screenshot of an email they received from GoFundMe saying, "Thank you for the efforts to help those affected by the earthquakes in Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon."
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Just rationally speaking, maybe we mentioned Turkey because there are more people there, but the problems with the earthquake, the effect of the earthquake, was felt in Syria possibly worse than in Turkey. So to even order it in that way, Turkey, Syria, is indicative of how they think about the situation. So GoFundMe is closely monitoring events in the region, and we're committed to helping people help those in need. The twist came in the following paragraph, in which the email read, "As a U.S. company, we are required to follow our terms and services, or our terms of service, payment industry requirements, and applicable laws, including those set by the U.S. Treasury Department, which prohibit GoFundMe from allowing fundraisers meeting this criteria to raise money on our platform. For this reason, we're writing to let you know that your GoFundMe account's been closed due to sanctions involving an unsupported country and a violation of the prohibited conduct section of our terms of service. This email, or the email concluded." "I'm absolutely disgusted and enraged by this," the user commented. Another user reported in German that they set up a GoFundMe and managed to collect some $10,000, or £10,000, but their bid to raise funds for Syria fell flat after the firm sent them an email informing them that the fundraiser was suspended because you appear to be raising funds for a cause in a location currently subject to economic sanctions by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or other relevant government agencies. We are not even allowed to donate to those in need. Unbelievable. I'm angry and speechless. Many other prominent activists, such as Max Blumenthal and Hadi Nasrallah, highlighted the fact that the West was not allowing Syria to receive funds after having funded terrorist organizations in the country. Thanks to criminal Western sanctions, international cargo planes cannot land at Syrian airports, and Syrians cannot use GoFundMe or credit cards. Meanwhile, the U.S. military occupies 1/3 of the country, stealing Syria's oil, a key source of revenue it uses to buy food and aid, Blumenthal said on Twitter. GoFundMe is suspending fundraisers for Syrians in the regions under the Sanctions Act, Aleppo included. Thousands of dollars have been frozen because someone somewhere in the U.S. said Syrians must be punished, Nasrallah pointed out. All the while, as GoFundMe was prohibiting aid from making it into Syria, the fundraising organization was flaunting that more than $100,000 were raised to support the White Helmets, an NGO organization operating in Syria that's been accused of colluding with the West and terrorist organizations to commit and stage human rights violations in the country. This comes after the United Nations stressed on Thursday the need to avoid politicization of aid to earthquake victims in Syria and urged Washington and Brussels to ensure there were no impediments. Western countries are not providing necessary aid to the Syrian government, which is dealing with the fallout of the devastating earthquake, and only send them to areas in Syria that are controlled by militant terrorist groups, the Syrian President's Special Advisor Boutaina Shaaban said on Thursday. Unfortunately, the West only cares about areas where the terrorists are, where the White Helmets are, but they don't care about the areas in which most Syrian people live. Most of the money and all of the equipment has been dispatched to Turkey from Europe and from the U.S., nothing to Syria from Europe at all, Shaaban told British broadcaster Sky News. This is happening as thousands, including children, are still calling for help from under the rubble in Syria. However, the rolling crisis through which most Syrians are living didn't gain international support, mainly due to the U.S. draconian sanctions. Moreover, officials say it'll be years before the streetscapes of the stricken areas bear any resemblance to their old selves. As such, rebuilding is going to take a very long time. Some buildings may look okay from the outside. However, certain structural components might have been damaged to the extent that some of these buildings will have to be torn down, a process that alone could take years. And this is an example of GoFundMe that is White Helmet has an impetus on helping the white helmets, and it's being allowed. All right, you're going to watch this space. We will return with more world news.